Welcome to Divine Dose, a life beyond your drunken dreams, life on purpose and empowered, a spiritually intoxicating space where we let spirit led people who want more in to live a hot, holy, and whole life. Today, I'm honored to welcome a truly powerful woman in recovery, Kesho. She's been sober for 38 years, and her journey is nothing short of inspiring, a miracle. Originally from Detroit, Kesho has lived her life as a feminist and activist, always standing on the front lines of change. She's a college professor who taught sociology and American studies, bringing both wisdom and fire to the classroom. Beyond her professional work, she's the proud mother of 4 adult children and grandmother to 6 beautiful grandchildren. Kesho has dedicated her life to service and inclusion, helping shape the path of recovery for others, and has led milestones that continue to impact countless lives. I can't wait to dive into her story, her vision for inclusivity and recovery, and the wisdom she's gathered from nearly 4 decades of sober living. Kesho, welcome to the show.
Rachel, thank you, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to share what I know about recovery.
Oh my goodness. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Well, let's open up. So you've been sober for 38 years. Wow. Can you take us back to that beginning when was your turning point?
Thank you for asking me to reflect like that. You know, I grew up in a family in Detroit that practiced drinking on the weekends. The men worked hard in the factory and the women stayed at home with the kids. And drunkenness, drinking and drunkenness was part of, I don't know, kind of the culture. It's what men did because they worked hard. It was their reward. But when they drank, that was one thing. But when the drinking is turned into violence and disrupted families and infidelity and all of those things that put pressure on marriages, this is what I saw in my parents' marriage. I didn't know there was a disease of alcoholism. I just knew I didn't want to be like that. My father was an abuser of my mother, and that really put a real dent on how I thought I didn't want to drink. So drinking for me wasn't something I confronted until I actually went to college and people were drinking, and I started around that time. I still didn't know there was a disease called alcoholism, which, by the way, wasn't diagnosed in the American Medical Society until Association until the 1950s. But understand, I'm born in the 50s, raised in the 60s, and I find myself drinking and not being able to stop. And that scared me. And by the way, I didn't stop till I was 33. So I didn't have a drunk driving. I didn't lose my children. I had some divorces, but I recognized that my personality changed when I drank. And that scared me. And I started getting feedback from others. You know, you're weird, you're mean, you're whatever. And I started seeking solutions. Let me tell you what I tried. Oh, I tried reading all the Oprah books. I went to a priest and asked for it to be saved and give some communion. I I thought, well, let me take a walk in nature. Let me change what I drink. Let me drink only on Tuesdays. Let me drink only on the Wednesday. So of course I used my best thinking, and because I'm a smart ass woman, I thought, well, I'll find my own solution. And I started talking to people who had their solutions, and I realized I needed some help. So in my instance, that led me to education as a pathway toward how I was going to solve my alcoholism. And when I learned that I had was in the clutches of a disease, that's what scared me. And being in the clutches of a disease that has no cure, alcoholism, the American Medical Association says, has no cure. That scared the bejesus out of me. So that's what started my journey. And of course, I'm going to make this quick. You know, I did something stupid in public. I didn't get arrested, but they called the police. And I said, oh my God, you know, I'm like those crazies that hide under the viaduct. I'm a drunk and I'm out of control. So I started seeking help. And that's what turned me around 38 years ago. I'm happy now, but I wasn't happy then.
Right? Yeah, we think that that's where the party's at until the party is over and
Yes.
we're the last one standing and no one thinks it's funny.
No
Oh, thank you
kidding.
for that. So, a lot of people, I think, even just considering getting into this way of life, it's like there's this unknown, right? I didn't know what I didn't know. Like, I didn't know what a life without drinking looked like. So, what did early recovery look like for you, and how did you build a foundation that's lasted nearly 4 decades?
That's a great question. Thank you for letting me unpackage that. Since I was a college professor and trained to research and to apply that research to a problem, that skill itself helped me look for alternatives. I mean, most people know there's Alcoholics Anonymous, they know there are treatment centers, they know people go back to church and have spiritual experiences and stop drinking. We know that people have a baby, they get married, and their life is altered. I think one of the things that turned my life around and which made me more cognizant of how I wanted to live was motherhood. I found myself pregnant at 25, married, and I said, I'm not going to do that. And that was a strong enough motivation to stop drinking. But it wasn't a strong enough motivation to do what you said, and that is to commit to a life of not drinking. That's something I had to learn how to live without drinking, how to deal with those impulses to want to drink. So I found and I looked at many solutions, but education was truly a super part of that. And meeting people who were like me, also trying to find how to live sober. And that was really touching. People were very generous in their experience. I mean, if you can imagine me being 33 years old, asking for help for older people who I didn't even relate to. But all of a sudden, they had a wisdom and knowledge which was different than mine. So I had to seek it, and I had to listen, and I had to become teachable. And those are some of the things that made early recovery extremely difficult. Um, you know, the Alcoholics Anonymous organization says we live one day at a time. I think for many of us, it's 1 minute at a time when you don't know how to live sober, to remove the alcoholism, not only out of your body, but out of your home, out of your social life, out of your spiritual life. Like those are skills that I found that I had to develop, and I saw people who had developed those skills, and I started imitating their lives. And it wasn't easy. I mean, I'd go to a party and people say, "You're not drinking." Then I'd have to give them an explanation, or I'd go to a funeral and where people drink, and I didn't choose that. And how to handle people who were drinking, how to not pose a judgment on other people because they chose to drink. All of those things I had to learn. So early recovery was challenging. I say I'm in decades. The first decade was just learning how to do that. The second decade was how do I play a role in helping other people who also want to join a sober and an alcohol free life. The third decade was carrying the message around the world. I have a job that sent me all around the world, and I realized this problem was global. Oh my God. And the fourth decade is turning it back to my own family. I'm a grandmother now, and looking at those patterns in my grandchildren, my adult children. I have four, and I see that this is a real family problem. So putting some emphasis on bringing the message to my family and those that are closer to me, and even some of my students, has been what I've been looking at in the last decade, and playing an educational role with corporations, churches, who want to know what to do with their clients or their, congregations who have problems. So I played that role too.
I really love the part where you were speaking to the importance of a community and other people who were uh, walking that path that you didn't yet know. And I think that's so important for anybody
Mm-hmm.
because, for so long, I didn't know where to go and who to talk to. And, I felt really alone. I started reading books, but it didn't deliver me to be surrounded by anybody. So there was nothing to really hold me to a new way of life or show me, the new steps. And I also loved, and we'll talk more about this later, but how people find different paths to get there. I tried the church path. I went there. I went up to the front of the stage. I had them pray over me. I was looking for it. I was looking for where and how and who. So, and we'll talk more, like I said, about that later. But
Sure.
yes, the importance of community has, for me, been paramount for my recovery. And so, as a professor of sociology and American studies, how did your academic work inform your understanding of addiction and recovery?
Well, in my case, it started a couple of ways. I had the problem of drinking too much, and I had to learn how to stop. And stopping did involve having to have a higher purpose, believe it or not. So, from the personal higher purpose, I wanted to meet other people who were struggling with this, and I was fortunate enough that my institution had a course in the women's prison, which wasn't far from the college that I taught at, and I decided to take up that course and teach it for a semester. And in doing so, I realized that a lot of those women, through research, through discussions, through interviews, a lot of those women were in jail for drug and alcohol related problems. They had ended up there because those substances were involved. So, in helping teaching them about addiction, the larger umbrella category, it inspired many of them to finish their sentences, and it also pushed me to learn more about the 3 or 4 ways that people stop drinking and stay stopped. And then, so that was a personal motivation then, and a professional one intersecting for me. And that made me study, say, for example, the history of Alcoholics Anonymous, the history of treatment centers, the history of famous people who had been AA, Alcoholic Anonymous champions, people who in the religious community had started support groups in their churches for people with alcohol problems. So I was lucky. I could do the intellectual part, the historical part, but I could also be very helpful because I could bring my own experience. I was no longer drinking, and I had a higher purpose, and that higher purpose was to help others.
I felt that. And I'm interested to know about, and this segues perfectly into our next conversation, which is talking about how sometimes, Alcoholics Anonymous doesn't work for some, and it does
Mm-hmm.
for others. You mentioned, showing up at church, and then you also just mentioned you studied that there were 3 to 4 ways that people were studied to stop and stay stopped. So can you speak to that, how there are these different pathways that people can choose, and how, some people may not always be a real alcoholic like I or myself, so speaking to that, and what you've discovered, for those who are listening, especially who are, seeking.
Thank you for that question, too. That's a great question that is often asked when I do trainings for corporations, trainings for uh, hospitals, trainings for uh, um, what I would call church related boards who are trying to help their parishioners. So let me say I consider these to be different lanes, but the lanes are all informed by a root. And I think that root has its history in Alcoholics Anonymous. So let me segue a little bit into that and then tell you the 3 lanes that I think people find recovery under from the research point of view. Alcoholics Anonymous was started in 1935 by 2 men who were very successful, a stockbroker and a doctor, but they couldn't stop drinking and they couldn't stay stopped. And they drove their wives crazy and their family were scared to death. And the way they found the solution was to help each other. When they realized that giving service was the motivation enough for them to stay stopped, they said one question to themselves. One, what is this higher power that we got to have? And maybe it's helping others. But if we have this problem and we've stopped, maybe we can help other people. And it's that generosity of Alcoholics Anonymous. So in 1935, there were 2 members, with 5. And by 1939, there were 100 members. And of course, they published that famous AA book, the big book, I think they call it. And by 1950, there were almost 100,000 and 3,600 groups in the United States. And today, when you fast forward, you're talking about 3 to 4 million people in the United States, 126,000 groups all over the United States, and about 11.5 million people around the world. Now, understand something. This is against the face of there probably being 237 million people who have the problem of addiction, whether their substances alcohol, whether their substances drugs, whether their substances shopping, whether their substances codependent relationships. We become addicted to processes as well as chemicals. And now in 1950, they figured out that alcohol was mostly in the brain. They said that in the big book, but the science caught up with it by 1950 and clearly realized that there's a part of the brain that some of us inherit that makes those of us, weak and vulnerable to substances, whatever they might be, whatever the process. I mean, if you sit up and watch 14 episodes of a show on television and you can't leave, there's something you're connected to. It's fulfilling a need. So fast forward today, what the research shows is that there's a correlation between a belief that 1, there is a solution, 2, that solution is outside of yourself, and 3, that solution has to be lived in a lifestyle. So the best organization for people who are working with that for many, and probably the vast majority, would be Alcoholics Anonymous. Alcoholics Anonymous, as I said, has inspired at least, they say, 40 different recovery programs who use the same philosophy of their 12 steps. So that's one lane. People who join a fellowship, people who do service, people who stay sober one day at a time, people who carry the message, and for some reason, somehow, they believe that the obsession to drink, to use, to hurt themselves, hurt others, to be sick in the brain, they believe, mentally ill, gets removed. That's what they believe. That's one lane. Okay? Now, there might be some debate as to whether how long you drink, what you drink, and all those kinds of questions, but that data is not substantiated. Sometimes people drink a very short time and still are alcoholics. Some people drink a lot and stop drinking, and they're alcoholics too. So Alcoholics Anonymous doesn't diagnose any person. They let people do that for themselves. So that's one lane, and that one is 90 years old, and it has worked for millions of people. The second lane is the lane of trauma, and treatment centers have been the most successful since the 70s. They've had treatment centers since the turn of the century. Kellogg's, the people who make the cornflakes, opened up the first treatment center for the rich and the famous then, and they could go and rest. And they believed that rest was related to the stress they were under, their wealth, their prestige, and their status. And if they rested well, they wouldn't have a desire to drink. So that lane is treatment centered oriented. The treatment center from 1900 was still dressed around moral failure. But by the 1970s, treatment centers clearly understood that it was a medical problem and that people needed medical help, which is why treatment centers detox and people for safety reasons. And people basically believe that detox gives people a different direction through a withdrawal, and then an alternative way of living, They have halfway houses and all those things that have come out of detox. So it's been a lane, and it works for a large percentage of people who have the problem. We don't quite know why it works. We just know that for some people, a detox for 30 to 60 days, a treatment center experience where you begin to look at your trauma, and who, Rachel, is without trauma? Nobody. Right? So, the treatment centers are very good for that, and they're specific to the nuances, whether you're a rock star and you got a drug problem, or whether you're a housewife and you're bored out of your mind, to people who've been traumatized through violence, loss of life, military. Treatment centers tend to work. There's a real strong capacity for them to work. And they're not necessarily designed around religion. That's a choice of the person who is seeking treatment. And then the third lane is the lane of religion. Religion is a wonderful institution if it works for the person, because it is a lifestyle, it is a commitment to, AA calls it a higher power, but churches call it God. Whether those churches are Christian, whether they're Buddhist, whether they're Islamic, they believe in some sort of higher entity. And they work because generally families are there. They believe in the principle of forgiveness. They believe that under the influence they were of the devil, that they are now under the protection of God or an angel or whatever they want to believe. There's no moral judgment. There's no hierarchy in any of these lanes. But that lane is very effective too. And many people have multiple experience in one lane and find the second lane or the third lane, or they go the other way. They go to church, then they go to treatment centers, and then they go to Alcoholics Anonymous. So there's no judgment. Now, let me just quickly say there's emerging a fourth lane. And if the fourth lane has more to do with education and situational issues, and a sense of meeting the need to not be alienated in modern society. There's something has happened when we were at least 170 million people at one time in the United States, and now we're, 250 million. People spend a large amount of time working. Women have gone, there are two family household, working people in a household. Children are alienated, and on and on and on. The critique, and I'm going to end this so that we can ask another question, but the critique is that this is a lifestyle problem, that our life in modernity is too complicated, and people are stressed the frick out. And in that stress, they're trying to find alternative ways, giving up the big fancy corporate jobs and going back to the farm, or living in households where they have other family members, creating collective households. So this one is taking root, but it's not massive yet. We don't have millions of people doing it, but there are a lot of people who are choosing that lane and starting off their life in that lane and saying, I'm not going down that lane of modernity. I want to belong. And the way to belong is get close to the land, get close to family, get close to purpose. That isn't religious necessary. It can be. So it's very interesting, this new lane. And across this lane, finally, is all four lanes, is the differences of experience with people who are in different cultures. African Americans may do any of those four lanes differently than people who are Spanish speaking, or people who are recent immigrants, or people who are Anglo whites. And now we're accumulating the data from people in those lanes for the pluses and minuses. I hope that's historical in a way that helps.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because being able to hear, I think sometimes people feel, I was launching this sober summit and a woman was like, I really want to go to this, but I don't, I don't consider myself sober necessarily, but I am alcohol free and I choose that for my own, reasons and ways. And I'd love to feel like I am welcome in a community like this. And I've been noticing a lot. I live in Austin, Texas, and I'm noticing a very big what they call like zero proof movement or alcohol free movement, and people who are seeking these answers. They don't consider themselves alcoholics or even sober, but they want to do life differently, and they want to do it with people, and they've seen how maybe they, whatever reason they may have, to remove this substance so that they can show up more fully, or to be able to get back to the roots, so to speak, how you were saying, a different way of life. And so I'm really glad that people who are listening can hear themselves in one of those lanes, and then to see that there is a way to be supported, and that there is a community, and that there's even this growing new state, so that and then how we can all um, look at too. We may be in different lanes, but and still we are seeking something that's bigger than what we've been shown, that's different than the trauma, to heal, to healthy self and heal thyself. So thank you for sharing that. And you
I want to
began.
say that what has created that fourth lane is exactly what you nailed, and that is people want to feel good about their decision to want to be alcohol and substance free because of the issue of stigma. So in the 1930s, it was a hell of a stigma. People hid that they drank. By the 1950s, the American Medical Association said that alcoholism was a disease. People felt a little reprieve. By the 70s, with the emergence of the treatment centers, people felt victorious because they succeeded in those treatment centers. And by 2000 and later, the next 25 years, people are succeeding in recovery around changing their lifestyle. And many people have said that they've seen the rigidity and the identities. I'm not the identity of my issue. Like I'm not a drug addict. That's not my identity. I'm not an alcoholic. That's not my identity. So what has pushed that fourth lane is people don't want the identity. They want the healing, but they don't want the identity. So you nailed it. You're absolutely right. And we're collecting data from that now to see how effective that is. Is it effective for the long term? Does it address the immediate crisis? By the way, we do know this too. Most people who eventually become dependent on any substance, any process, has those problems way before they pick up the substance and process. So low self-esteem, incest in families, violence, even growing up with threats of violence in terms of authoritarian parents. Some of this stuff creates the conditions of people not feeling good about themselves, which makes them vulnerable to addiction, whatever it is. Even if you're trying to have 5 marriages and you want to marry Mr. Right or Miss Right and move up and only find that that's superficial. All of those things are up for discussion now in a way that this is where the addiction community has helped people take what's personal and private and make it public and something that we can discuss and bring new information to the choices people can make. This is a plus.
Yes, and this is really speaking to how you're saying the there's this foundation that's set up that can possibly lead to being more, I don't know, open to the addiction or the processes. And how we were talking before we got on this call about how what happens oftentimes is like, okay, I may have the ism, right? The alcoholism, but then I start to treat that through a new way of life, religion, church, maybe Alcoholics Anonymous, okay? And then what happens sometimes though is that that ism, or that state is still there. And so it jumps to a new potential process, like you were speaking to, or a new substance. And maybe you can speak briefly on what happens with that, and what do we do? Because you've been in this, you've been walking this way for 4 decades, almost 4 decades. So yeah, speaking to why that happens, and what we can now do about that, and how those different lanes get to still approach that and heal that as well.
So, this phenomena that you're talking about, switching addiction or dancing around multiple addiction, I did find that in my research, but let me draw from my own personal experience around that. So it's grounded in something that I bet people can relate to. So, coming from a troubled background of poverty, racism, sexism. Remember, I'm born in the 50s where there wasn't even a women's movement yet, and certainly not a civil rights movement. I grew up under a lot of stress, and my body, my nervous system biologically, and my emotional system, really reacted to those kind of things. And I didn't know how to give myself comfort in ways that were healthy. This I had to learn, not only from those old people who told me that there were alternatives to living substance free, but from the society, which was revving up to be bigger and better and stronger and more powerful. And by the way, I'm not critiquing that, but that way of being driven wasn't good for me. It wasn't good for me. And so, one of the things that has been very helpful is that I have to keep my stress level down so that I'm not in an anger state, a victim state, a fighting state, all of those things which weren't good for me. Now, how did that learning that information that has come from my battle with alcoholism, how did that show up in my lifestyle? Well, guess what? I did not live a lifestyle to keep up with the Joneses. I chose not to. I didn't go out and buy $3,000 couches and $2,000 shoes. I did not become a materialist. I chose to keep my lifestyle and my later marriage and parenting simple. I chose to live not in the city, but in the more rural area. Not rural, but in a way where my life was contained and simple because I understood the relationship between stress and my craving to want to re-pick up that alcohol. So again, this switched addiction is related to that. If you think people say in interviews that giving up drinking or drugging or whatever you're doing is, what are you going to do after that? That's sobriety, that's getting clean. But people need recovery from the traumas that they've lived in their life, in their body, those traumas, some release and healing, but the emotional impact of that trauma. So for many people, they stop drinking and then they pick up the food. I mean, if you go to some meetings in Alcoholics Anonymous, more than half of the people in that room are overweight and obese, right? If you go to churches, you'll see a massive, particularly in the African American church, a massive amount of people who are absolutely obese and also materialists. They're driving the best cars, the best jewelry, the best hairstyles, the best. It's wonderful. I'm not against any of that, but they're spending money, crippling themselves with materialism, which is addressing an outside issue of themselves and not an inside. So this switched addiction is very real. I knew of a woman who, got sober. She was a party animal. She was a motorcycle queen. She was amazing. She's one of them, avant-garde women in the 70s and 80s. But her drinking took off and she quit drinking. But then she turned to shopping. And within 2 years of her sobriety, she had run up a tab of about $100,000. I know people who turn to gambling. Oh, it's just, I'm going to go to the casino and have a little fun because they never learned how to have fun in a healthy way. So they go and pick up fun in another way that ends up causing financial and hardships in their life. Or people who pick up love and sex addiction issues. They turn to it's not really about the sex, it's really about the excitement and their body being revved up for that. So this switched addiction is real. And finally, the biggest one, the one that's mostly American, particularly, is this issue of codependency. People not having boundaries. So they don't know how to say yes. They don't know how to healthily say, no. They don't know how to have fun. They don't know how to dial it down. They don't know how to change their old reactions. So you're absolutely right. That recovery in that switched addiction phenomena, people look up and say, basically, screw it. I tried this lane and it didn't work. I tried that lane. I tried all these lanes, but I still feel addictive and compulsive. So the American Medical Society argues that people are compulsive obsessive, which is a brain issue, right? So again, these might become some of the things that one has to take a look at in their life. There's certainly solutions in any of those lanes, but the switched addiction is a real phenomena, and people have to be extremely careful about that because that second addiction can be worse than the first. For some people, it can be worse. I mean, you look at somebody who quit drinking, but they're 120 pounds heavier, putting pressure on all those precious organs in their body because they can't stop eating, right? And although the eating isn't getting them arrested for drunk driving, the eating is killing them in a different way. The eating is making them leave their families at night and go to the drugstore and buy a bunch of junk. And then when they're drunk off the food, they get up in the morning and they can't take care of their kids. So it throws their life off. So the research now is looking at this phenomena of shifting addictions and the awareness that people need to have about it.
Wow, there's so much information there that I'm like, everyone go re-listen to this episode so you can get all of the pockets of inspiration, the influence, and one of the most important things I think I hear from that too is no matter which lane that you're in, it's like it's a continual daily decision, to continually, no matter what it is, it's a continual state of living in a conscious awareness of, oh, I'm deciding this, I'm turning this over, or I'm can continue this faith, this path, because this experience that I've had, yes, it's overcome in this day, and it's contingent upon me choosing and staying in this lane and this and in this as a way of life, whether it's like you said through religion or through this new community that's being built out of people who are wanting to get back to their roots, or through Alcoholics Anonymous, all of these decisions that you can make, but that it's a continual a decision, a lifestyle. And for all of those who are listening, right now, like what we're having this conversation is putting you in that mindset, putting us in that this state of awareness of, oh, right, we have this one day, and we get to choose however is working for us to stay in recovery. Thank you so much. You have just blessed us in more ways than I can count. I'm not even joking. I want to go back and re-listen because there's just so many nuggets of gold and miracles in this that when I hear it, I know that this is landing on the ears and the hearts that are really open and ready to hear it. So thank you so much for coming on today, and thank you for being vulnerable, sharing your not just your history, but the history of recovery and this dis-ease, and to really show us that we're not alone. We are absolutely not alone. This is not a new thing. It's been going on for centuries, and now we have tools, principles, communities, and insights that people are ready to hear, ready to get educated on, ready to be inspired by, ready to be moved by. And so thank you so much today for blessing us. To everyone listening, may Kesho's story inspire you to step more boldly into your own recovery, your own activism, and your own legacy. Stay dosed, stay divine, and don't settle for fine. Thank you so much, Kesho. Kesho, many blessings. Thank you. Yeah.